Moving from public health to public health in a more existential way, we recently caught up with Extinction Rebellion, the decentralized coalition of powerhouse climate action that recently launched their pointed campaign to, essentially save humanity. Of course, that's no small feat, but also these are no small actions. Earlier this month, Extinction Rebellion shut down the 5 main bridges in London. Earlier last month. Hosted a queer dance party outside the Brazilian embassy, connecting the issues of human rights with climate change. They've held panels on ecocide, hosted multiple trainings on everything from media to lockdowns and know your rights to prison abolition. They've organized solidarity actions around Europe, including one for the Swedish teenager on a school strike for the climate, demanding decisive action from the Swedish parliament and other governments as well. In short, Extinction Rebellion is combining the power of incredible local organizing with global networking and outreach. For more on recent events and the road ahead, we talked with George Barda from Extinction Rebellion. Take a look.
I think the reason this has touched such a chord, even at the fairly embryonic stage that we're still at, is because unlike most of the other activist movements that have been kind of heroically targeting some of the worst aspects of the climate crisis, like fracking in this country particularly, this is bringing the critique straight back to central government and the need for basically a systematic plan of transformation, which is really the only thing that makes sense now of the climate science that all our governments except for Trump have accepted in principle, but clearly have not accepted in practice in terms of what it actually demands of them.
So I want to get into the demands here. The 3 demands that you've listed: governments need to tell the truth about the ecological crisis, along with the media, a World War II scale climate mobilization for zero emissions and drawdown by 2025, and a participatory democracy. Specifically, talk about that wartime effort to address this issue.
So essentially, like for all the talk about, for decades about, we can't afford renewable energy and all this rubbish, plenty of work has already been done to show that when once you've made the upfront investments in renewable energy, you start making your money back very quickly, because the energy is effectively free once you've got the infrastructure in place. And so all we're effectively talking about is redirecting economic activity from, share buybacks and yachts for billionaires and any number of the other kind of insane ways of using the Earth's, precious and already overused resources that we see in the neoliberal economy. So I think in the short to medium term that the great opportunity that this represents is that not only do we have a chance of preventing the destruction of life as we know it, something like a massive Green New Deal is the best way to kind of burst the bubble of incipient fascism, which, as many people I think understand, feeds off rampant inequality of the kind that we have now, and there are of course very kind of stark lessons to be learned and seemingly to be ignored by the power system in terms of the depression in starting before the Depression, the unimaginable excesses of the 1920s and rampant inequality, followed by the crash, followed by austerity after the crash. And that in many places led to fascism. And we're seeing exactly the same process play out where, because the powers that be were in such a powerful position when the financial crisis hit, despite the fact that they kind of lost their legitimacy at that moment, they were in a position to manipulate that historical moment to make sure that the post-crash response essentially is all about, remunerating them even further and off the backs of the majority of people. And so to link it back to the sort of massive Green New Deal that we need, that would create millions of jobs, at least 500,000 in the UK, and like retrofitting some of the most inefficient housing in Europe that we have, the long-term jobs in terms of building out the renewable energy infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So this really is an enormous, positive social and economic opportunity in the short to medium term to deal with most of our other enormous problems, none of which are quite as enormous as the question of whether we kind of enable our future survival, but all very, very significant nonetheless.
And talk about, because there's on the left, there's always this back and forth about working within the system or affecting change outside the system. And since your demands are very distinct about government, the governments being the ones to make these decisions, what is your feeling about that issue of electoral politics and the issue of of oftentimes too slow reform.
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, one of the kind of mercies of this historical moment is just the sheer geophysics of our current ecological predicament cuts through that ancient and divisive progressive political debate about whether kind of grassroots bottom up is better than fast top down, because we literally have no choice but to work out some way, impossible though it may seem, to actually get our hands on the reins of power and take hold of that system and deploy it to transform the way our economies work right now. But I think quite simply to cut through kind of ideology to some extent, as long as it is both legal and profitable to destroy life itself will be destroyed. And that means somehow getting hold of the legislative capacity of our governments and directing that towards the changes that are required to have a viable, breathable, and fairer, better future.
I want to talk about some of the tactics that you've been using and tactics that you intend to use in the future, because you mentioned, as long as it's legal to destroy the planet, then it, and legal and profitable. And of course, a lot of the things that you've been doing are civil disobedience, as in illegal actions that will cause arrest and other things like that. So talk a little bit about some of the tactics that you've been using.
Yes, I think basically there's this kind of like waking up that's happening across a large swathe of people, where 40 years of neoliberal Thatcherite propaganda that said there's no such thing as society, there's just individuals and families, we're not citizens anymore, we're basically just consumers. The history of women's rights, civil rights, workers' rights, things that we totally take for granted, like weekends. I mean, so much of what we celebrate as the kind of the benefits of liberal democracy were won through people putting themselves on the line and disrupting the status quo by breaking the law. And the literature on this is fairly clear that the more people are prepared to risk their liberty, the more difficult the position the authorities find themselves in, because it's what they call a dilemma action, in that if you break the law, because the law is so fundamental to everything functioning at all, it's a kind of direct challenge to state power. And so obviously there's an incentive to crack down on law breaking. But as we've seen in recent months in this country, where a judge, albeit it was turned over very quickly by the Court of Appeal, and it turns out that the judge that gave this ruling had some fossil fuel interest, but basically 3 people were jailed for an anti-fracking protest, and that caused an immediate reaction where more people did those kind of actions. And so when the authorities crack down, there's very good evidence to suggest that more people will be outraged by that and will take part in action. Of course, if the authorities don't crack down and just let people break the law in increasing numbers, then that's a threat to the stability of the system as well. And as somebody that's been on numerous sort of protests and actions where the police effectively, the state in the form of the police have this kind of trump card where they can throw a certain sort of legal designation at a certain gathering, section this, section that, and suddenly everybody becomes arrestable. When you're part of a movement where the vast majority of people have joined on the basis that they are arrestable, it means that trump card that the authorities have to disrupt protest action then disappears. I mean, to be clear, this is not about in any way kind of critiquing the approach of direct action, which, as opposed to civil disobedience, is about taking actions at particular sites of damage, where, as well as obviously a sort of symbolic political aspect that is shared with civil disobedience action, the specifics of direct action are about concretely trying to stop something in practice that's really bad at that moment. Civil disobedience is about going directly to those that effectively legislate for that thing to be allowed, and demanding of them the change. Because I think this is a particularly important kind of turn in history at this moment, not least because as Naomi Klein's shock doctrine made very clear, I think one of the great kind of tricks of disaster capitalism is to throw so many kind of catastrophic things at us, whether it's tar sands or Arctic drilling or fracking or cuts or hospital closures or any number of the other things they're doing to us, that we end up so busy trying to sort of firefight those attempts to make things even worse that the pre-existing status quo effectively remains unchallenged.
So finally, I want to talk about the road ahead, because one of the things that always pops up with actions like these, they're incredibly powerful in the moment, and then they, you know, fizzle or something like that, or they stay very localized. So talk about the staying power with regards to Extinction Rebellion, as well as the international.
So I think to some extent, like this is obviously insanely ambitious, but I think the reason it's touched such a chord is that it is absolutely necessary. And so ultimately the success of this will depend entirely on how many people engage with it and connect with it and help amplify the process. We're using a way of organizing that's quite different to most sort of grassroots activist organizing, which is called philocracy. So instead of having a kind of consensus process like Occupy, where everybody has to agree on everything before it happens, things are set up in a much more sort of functional way so that anybody can take any kind of action that is in solidarity with the principles and values of the movement. So you don't have to have everything agreed by everybody, because I think the experience of a lot of us who are involved in Occupy and various other similar movements is that in the face of kind of fast changing situations and growing movements, you end up spending a huge amount of time and energy trying to kind of work through fairly basic decisions. And I guess the key difference, and this is worth sort of emphasizing perhaps also, is that this is not attempting to be a total kind of prefigurative politics. This isn't about setting up a movement that kind of mirrors the utopian ideal democracy that we'd all like to see. This is about trying to set up a functional structure for a rebellion campaign that is good enough to empower people to act in a hopefully sort of mushrooming way across the world. And what's been really inspiring is that we've had so much interest from across the US, from across Europe, from all sorts of places. And, you know, as I say, people involved in, you know, the struggles in Africa as well. I think many people realize that this has to work because we have no time to delay. And the broad answer to your question is it will work to the extent that more and more people are inspired to take part.
To learn more about Extinction Rebellion and to join the rebellion, visit xrebellion.org. And to hear the full interview with George, stream or download our podcast, Act Out, available on iTunes, Libsyn, Stitcher, and Spotify.